Welcome to another conversation in People in Fundraising. This podcast features interviews with nonprofit professionals who discuss their career journeys, lessons learned, and enthusiasm for working in fundraising. And here is your host, the founder of People in Fundraising, Tim Wilson.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another conversation in the People in Fundraising podcast webcast, which I started about 2 years ago to spotlight industry professionals, and they can talk about their joys, their passions, their challenges, how they've grown in the nonprofit development world. And today I'm very excited to welcome today's guest, Misa Lobato, to our program. Good afternoon, Misa.
Hi, Tim.
It's good to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And Misa, do you want to just tell our audience by title, by employer, what you do in your day job, please?
Sure. So currently I am the Director of Prospect Development for Medical Philanthropy at Virginia Commonwealth University, but I work remotely for VCU. I live in Rhode Island. Prior to this position, I was working as the Director of Prospect Management and Analytics at the Rhode Island School of Design and as a senior consultant with the Inclusion firm. And I, prior to that, I worked at the University of Colorado for 18 years. And at the time that I left the University of Colorado, I was the Assistant Vice President of Advancement Strategy and Annual Giving. So I was overseeing prospect development, centralized annual giving, and I was also co-managing the reporting team.
Wow, lots of responsibilities there.
Yes.
Yeah, and that was in your native Colorado, right?
Yeah, I'm from Colorado. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I grew up in Southern Colorado and then went to school at CU Boulder and then started working at CU Boulder while I was a student. And then after I graduated, I got a temp position at the University of Colorado Foundation.
Okay. So. There's a lot of parallels, I think, in our careers. Like, we both spent 18 years at our first employer, and we both started at our first employer through temp jobs.
Yeah, it's interesting to be. I mean, I sometimes I think about that. Like, I will probably never have a relationship to an employer the way that I did with the University of Colorado, because it was just like I had been there for so long. I was so invested in so many ways. I'd been a student there. My father was a student there. It was just like part of my identity in so many ways. So.
Totally, yes. So let's start with those beginning days. As you graduated from the university, you got a temp job at the foundation. Were you aware of nonprofit work as a possible profession for you, or was it more like, as you were temping, that's when the door opened?
Yeah, when I was I was aware. In college, I was an ethnic studies major, and so I was really only interested in doing something that was related to social justice. Mm-hmm. And my mom, I think at the time that I started temping at the University of Colorado, my mom was doing grant writing for an environmental nonprofit in Colorado. Oh. And so I was aware of the sort of what the functionings of nonprofits were. I don't know that I necessarily thought that my entire career would be in nonprofits. Sure. And I guess that remains to be seen because I'm not dead yet. But I knew that I wanted to do something that felt like mission driven. Mm. And at the time that I graduated, I was an ethnic studies major at the University of Colorado. My senior year of college, the chair of my department and a professor of mine became an essay that he had written about 9/11 was sort of surfaced. This was in 2004 and 2004, 2005. And it was surfaced by the campus Republicans, and it kind of became very controversial. And then the ethnic studies department became like kind of came under attack, and there was the ethnic studies department was very small. So when I graduated,
about that.
You remember that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I graduated from college, it was and I was still living in Boulder. That was like still something that people were really like, you know, it came up in a lot of the interviews that I was having. And so when I started temping just because I needed to be able to work full time.
Sure.
And then I got a position in gifts and records at the University of Colorado Foundation for like the Christmas rush, and then I just stayed.
So going from the gifts and records, how did you get into prospect research in broadly prospect development? And then, as you mentioned, ultimately you had oversight of several critical functions in your last role there.
So when I worked in gifts and records for maybe a couple of years. I was hired full time, and then I became the lead record specialist. And at the time, so the University of Colorado had at one point 14 researchers, and a few years before I started, they had reduced the research team down to one part-time person. And at the time that I was in gifts and records, it had increased to, I think there was one part-time person, one full-time person, and maybe a student. And so then they posted a position. The position was really focused on proactive prospecting. And I didn't think I had some sense of what the prospect research team was doing because I was working alongside them in gifts and records. But I also, it felt very like bookish, and they were reading the newspaper, and it felt like, okay, I could see myself doing this. And so I applied for that position and got that position. And then I became involved in my chapter, joined my chapter board. My Apra chapter board, I should say. And then I was just, moving through different positions. So initially I was doing proactive prospect research, and then I started managing the prospect research team. And then we started kind of overseeing a lot of different components of performance management around the prospect management space. And then when I had been there for several years, when I was promoted to be an AVP, we had a significant restructuring, and I ended up taking on the annual giving team, which I loved. And I think annual giving, I'm a huge annual giving stan. And I think annual giving is so fascinating. And then we, the reporting team, which reported through another AVP who was overseeing information services, he didn't have a background in fundraising. And so we were really sort of aligning what our skill sets were. My skill set was in working directly with fundraisers and in serving in that kind of translational liaison
Yeah.
role, and so that was the way in which I was kind of helping the reporting department figure out how to take requests from the what the fundraising team needed and translate that through data. So
Yeah.
that was how I ended up in that kind of weird hodgepodge role. But yeah, when I took over annual giving, I think we maybe all thought that it would be temporary, but then I just kept doing it. So.
So interesting. And I also want to key in, you mentioned you had joined the local Apra board, Apra Rocky Mountains.
Yeah, it was CPRA at the time. It was the Colorado
Prospect Research?
Board of Apra.
Okay.
Yeah. But then it became Apra Rocky Mountains, actually, I think a year after I left the board, maybe something like that.
Okay. And from there, you ultimately became president of Apra International too, which we hadn't yet touched on. So just, kind of this amazing trajectory, 18 years, University of Colorado, and getting into prospect development within that time and overseeing annual giving and other facets. And while you were president of Apra International, you helped to found the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. So, Misa, if you could just maybe talk for a little bit about how that developed as an idea for we need a committee to address specific DEI. I think that'd be so fascinating to hear.
Oh, okay. Well, as I mentioned, my educational background is in ethnic studies, and I'm very justice oriented. I that has always been my focus. And when I started volunteering for Apra, I started volunteering in 2013, maybe.
Okay.
At one point I chaired a conference, and the speaker of the conference was Dan Pallotta, and I don't know if you attended that conference. It was in New Orleans, and Dan Pallotta is known for talking about how nonprofits get stuck in the starvation cycle, but he also talked in his keynote about his experience as a gay man and the legalization of gay marriage. And after that speech, there was some pushback from some people who felt like it was too political of a keynote speaker for Apra. And I ended up having a really interesting conversation with a board member. I was not a board member at the time, but really about like what is the obligation of professional associations to serve members across identities, and also what is the obligation of professional associations to take a political stance. And my feeling at the time was like, Apra members represent nonprofits, and nonprofits are inherently political, are inherently they're serving a social need that isn't being met by the government or being met by for-profit companies. And so so our members are living in politicized spaces, and so I felt and feel like Apra does have an obligation to sort of to think of itself in that way. When I joined the board, we we at one point we were going through a strategic planning exercise, and we were sort of talking about like what is our role in DEI, and I felt and continue to feel like Apra members are perhaps one of the best positioned professionals in fundraising to really um, impact a significant change in the way that we think about fundraising and the way that we think about engagement in embodying an inclusive vision for philanthropy. And also at the time that I was the president-elect was when the murder of George Floyd happened. And so there were a number of things. I was kind of campaigning for Apra to become a thought leader in DEI and in inclusive philanthropy. And that is how we decided to develop the DEI committee in Apra. We had the DEI committee at the time of George Floyd's murders, and so we were already really thinking about our, what does DEI mean in nonprofits, and what is our role in advancing social justice in nonprofits. And then when I became president, my priority was then for us to develop what became the DEI data guide, which was the ethical collection, storage, and use of identity data within philanthropy. So that's kind of how that happened.
That is fascinating, and thank you. And for our audience, that was not a question that I had given to Misa ahead of time. So thank you for impromptu answering, but giving such rich detail about the why of it. I was reading something recently, and it's a book by two women. One is a Democrat, one's a Republican, and they're quoting another author, and the author says, why needs to be the verb, and then the action, the subsequent actions of how and what and who are in service of that verb. Like why? So in this case, why do we need the DEI committee? And you articulated that really well. So thank you.
Well, one of the things that I think was really complicated for me in my career journey was, I have always been a very justice-oriented person. I was like in high school fighting against a super Walmart in my small hometown. I've always had a lot of strong political beliefs, but when I started working in nonprofits, when I started working in higher ed, I just had this inherent belief in the goodness of higher ed and in the goodness of nonprofits. And then because I worked in them for so long, I got to sort of really see the seedy underbelly of what it actually means to work in philanthropy, and the ways in which we do sometimes serve as a way for wealthy people to whitewash their sins, and to elevate their stature, and the ways that nonprofit actually feeds into cycles of inequity. And I just became really, fixated on this idea of solving the question of what is the role of philanthropy in social justice, and also what is the role of philanthropy in wealth redistribution, and one of the things that I really became kind of upset about was thinking about my role in research and prospect development and how I had I had been actively identifying prospects based upon wealth, based
Totally.
upon demographic factors that ended up like sort of perpetuating our the homogeneity of our donor base.
Yes.
And when I really was digging into that myself, I thought, like, okay, if I created a lot of this problem, then what do I do to solve it?
Sure.
And for me, the solution for that was, we have to be more aware of who our donors are and what the demographics of our donors are, and how well we are representing the communities that we're serving, and how representational our boards are, and the only way to sort of get at that from a meaningful data measurement perspective was to ask people for identity data,
Yeah.
and to get people past the point of thinking that identity data was like a taboo topic,
Oh, sure.
and to get people to feel more comfortable in thinking about how identity could be factored into our fundraising process. And that was what informed that thinking there.
Yeah. So interesting. Thank you for sharing all that detail, Misa. Um,
Maybe too much detail, but
that's no, it's so topical, and it remains, a significant question that lots of nonprofit, lots of people, certainly in prospect development, data advancement services, data analysis, like we all confront that homogeneity, you know, perpetuation with data, and looking at real estate records as the key indicator of wealth. So very timely. Thank you.
yeah. Thank you.
So on that same topic of identity, my next question, just as background here. So from September 15th through October 15th is Hispanic Heritage Month. And what I often try to do with these interviews is draw out not just the professional side, but maybe some of the personal side too. So for you, Misa, how might you celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, whether that's professionally and or personally? I'd be curious to hear.
Professionally, I would say it's still doing a lot of social justice oriented work. So since I've been working at VCU, I co-chaired a strategy team around VCU's use of identity data.
Okay.
I'm co-chairing the Inclusion Council. So I'm trying to continue to like center DEI in my professional life to some extent, even though I'm not consulting anymore. Personally, you had asked me before we started recording what I missed the most about Colorado, and I said the food. Where in Colorado at this time of year, I don't know if this is true in Utah. In Colorado at this time of year, and in New Mexico, this is when the green chili harvest comes in. And so if you go to a grocery store in Colorado, or if you're in Denver and you go to Federal Boulevard, there are green chili roasters all over the place. And they have these huge laundry baskets full of green chili, and then they throw them into the roaster and they roast it for you. And then they throw it into a garbage bag and you take it home and you have to peel it and seed it. And green chili is like a huge part of the culture of New Mexico and Colorado, and what I grew up with, like I grew up with so much green chili. And so I think the hardest part for me in having moved to New England was uh, not having there's Mexican food in New England, but it's not that style of Mexican food. And
Yes.
so I have to like find ways to get it. So when I moved here, it was in September
Oh,
5 years ago,
oh.
and we moved out here with coolers of green chili, and everywhere we stayed we had to put our green chili in the fridge. And then since then I've done like very different. I've had shipped fresh green chili. I've
Oh,
had shipped frozen green chili. Last year I went to Colorado in September um and brought green chili back on the plane.
awesome.
And so I'm trying to figure out what my green chili acquisition plan will be. That's that's my I mean, I'm kind of joking, but I do think I have a different understanding, having now lived in Rhode Island for 5 years,
Yeah.
of the way that food is such a central part of our cultural heritage, and was so central to my cultural heritage in ways that I didn't necessarily have to think about or interrogate,
Totally.
because I lived in Colorado until I was 38 years old. So I
Yes.
always had access to green chili. There was never a point, there's never a point where I was like, questioning whether I was going to be able to have green chili.
I totally relate to that. And I did the reverse. I went from New England out to the Intermountain West. And so seafood is certainly,
Yes.
one of the things that comes to mind. You just don't get it well out here. Um, and then you probably have seen this in the grocery store, but Hood Golden Eggnog around Christmas and the
Uh-huh.
holiday season. That I grew up on that. And then my four kids grew up on that. And then we moved to Utah. My wife's like, "What is this? It's like glue. This thing is awful." I absolutely love it. I found it one time down in Salt Lake City, and now we're looking for substitutes. So I totally get it. Like, it is such a cultural marker of these distinct regions of the country. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, it's funny too now, because now, having lived in Rhode Island for 5 years, there are very specific Rhode Island foods that now I feel like if I moved anywhere else, I wouldn't have access to them. Or like when I go to Virginia, which I go to Virginia fairly often, um, I end up like talking about a lot and trying to explain, like, what a clam cake is, and
Yeah.
like frozen lemonade. I brought my Virginia colleagues like packets of Dell's frozen
Yes,
lemonade.
yes.
So I'm not even I don't know if you know about Dell's versus Mr. Lemon, but I'm a Mr. Lemon girl.
Oh,
But
okay.
Dell's is the only thing that you could travel with. So the closest approximation.
Oh, that's good. So we got a couple more questions. I want to be mindful of your time, Misa. This has been just really informative and enjoyable. Um, I wanted to ask, I often draw quotes from other people that I then think a guest may want to take on and address. So this quote comes from Elizabeth Cologne, who has been the president of the National Association of Women Business Owners in the Chicago chapter. And she encouraged, quote, "Don't let fear stop you from achieving what you want." So for you, I would be interested to hear, how have you grappled with fears or uncertainties about, moving up in responsibility or moving across the country, or any fear about Apra leadership in time in your career. I'd love to hear what you have to share about that.
Um, you know, I think I I know that I, throughout all of those things, experienced a whole bunch of self-doubt,
Yeah.
and always thought that I, like, at any point people were going to realize that I'm not actually very credible as a professional. And
Mm.
but then when I was at the University of Colorado, I had a stroke
Oh,
at work.
oh my
And
goodness. Whoa.
when I was 36. And so I was at work, lying on the floor of my office. People were coming in, checking on me. Like, I think, none of us assumed that I was having a stroke.
Hmm.
And then finally, after many hours, my assistant called an ambulance, and they took me to the hospital. And, initially, I think I assumed that I was having a migraine, and then they said, like, you would really be feeling better by now if this was a migraine, because they were giving me medication, and they're like, are you sure that it couldn't be anything else? And then they
Mm.
ended up doing a CT scan with contrast, and then they realized that I had had a stroke, and then they sent me to the University of Colorado
Yeah.
Hospital, which is fortunately a stroke center. And so they were very familiar with the type of stroke that I had, which is not, it's actually kind of hard for a lot of people who have the type of stroke that I have, which is, a rare stroke in otherwise healthy young people.
Mhm.
Um, Often it's not diagnosed quickly. And fortunately, because I worked at the University of Colorado, and I went to the University of Colorado Hospital, they diagnosed it that day. But it was too late to do any of the work to reverse it.
Mm.
Um, and I think, you know, at that point, I remember that day, I had just all of these, I was doing so much stuff. It was like shortly before the Apra PD conference in Pittsburgh.
Oh
I
yeah.
was on the board. Um, I I had a couple of presentations to do for that conference. I was scheduled to meet with someone to talk about, but to finalize our presentation. And
Mm.
I was like lying on the floor of my office, like emailing people, going like, oh, I'm probably going to miss this. Probably going to miss this meeting. I'm not feeling well.
Mm.
And then that night, after I had had an MRI, and I had, talked to a neurologist, and everyone had left, and I was in the neuro ICU, was sort of the first time that I thought, um, I I live by myself. I am fully supported by my own income. Um, I'm fully reliant on having a job to
Yeah.
be able to support myself. Um, and I didn't know at that point, like, am I when am I going to walk again? Am I going to walk again? And I think that point, and that process, and that the process that I went through over the next few months of sort of then having to kind of navigate what stroke recovery looked like, and was a good clarifying exercise of sort
Mm.
of realizing that, like, um, I had been afraid of the wrong things, maybe.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So, I think, you know, like, by the time I moved to Rhode Island a little over a year after my stroke,
Okay.
very intentionally, because I took this job at RISD because I had always had this lifelong interest in interior design, and I
Oh,
thought maybe I'll pivot my career to interior design. And
yeah.
um, and but I didn't feel afraid of that. I didn't
Mm.
feel afraid of being APRA president necessarily. It was more just sort of like, really having to get real with myself about like what am I going to prioritize as, and that I had felt like maybe I had been prioritizing the wrong things.
Sure. That is a very humbling and grounding experience. I'm glad certainly, you got through it and are here today. Certainly. I had something similar in 2013, biking to work, broke my collarbone. 2 weeks later, I had blood clots. So I don't know how close I was to passing on, but so I'm sharing that because like I can relate, with these health scares that come up out of nowhere. And it's like it helps to think you have been focusing on the wrong things, or maybe the weight of your focus needs to shift. And
Yeah.
I like how you said that, like you were afraid of the wrong things.
I had this moment when I was home in the early days of my stroke recovery, where I was reading this book and I like just started the book itself was not sad. I just started crying because I was like, I could have never have read this book.
Yeah.
And this entire time I've been very, very focused on, am I going to become a VP of advancement? Is that what my career path is? And it suddenly felt so much more urgent that I read that book than that my career had progressed. So
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It is, it's one of those moments to kind of crystallize, what do I really want to do? What am I really grateful for? What is going to be my focus? Where am I going to devote my time, my energy, attention? So yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's powerful.
Yeah, I think I was trying to think about, fear. It's also, I have permanent brain damage. So like it's possible that part of my brain that like is afraid of things is dead. I don't know. But
Oh, yeah.
I feel like my risk tolerance is very, very high in lots of things, except like I'm so careful going up and down stairs. I have like no risk tolerance when it comes to like my own body.
Sure. That makes sense. Yes.
You will never catch me jumping out of a plane ever.
So I won't suggest that the next time I'm in Massachusetts, we go bungee jumping off a
No,
cliff.
I will not join you.
Yeah, no, I will never do that. So we're on the same page here. Well, Misa, we have about 5 minutes left, and I think this next question, you're the first one I've asked it to. I can't quite remember where I got the question, but I think it might tie in a bit to what you were just sharing so vulnerably with our audience. And thank you for doing that. So the question is, what lesson has life been teaching you lately? What comes to mind when you got that question?
Yeah, it's very related. And it is really related to like what is my relationship to achievement and what is my relationship to my career and what I in the time since my stroke I've had to a lot of things have changed. I have had to sort of I've had to learn how to navigate my life as a disabled person, but then also as an invisibly disabled person. So,
Yeah.
people's perception of me is that, that nothing has really changed. Um, and so, when I went back to work at the University of Colorado, I had only been back I only went back to work there part-time for a few months. And then I was like, I am so stressed by this. I can't do this. And I was so stressed by it before, but I was so driven by this idea of self-sacrifice as sort of like
Mm,
a way to kind of demonstrate my highest purpose, I guess.
sure.
And also I was so motivated by achievement. And um and are you familiar with the saying, if you're fed by the approval of others, you will be hungry forever?
I've heard something similar. Yes. Yeah.
Well, that was and is me. I
Yeah.
like was and continued, but I'm trying to not like need external validation, need some kind of proof externally from other people that I am like credible and smart.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
uh
Yeah.
and it's really, really hard. And it's also really hard too um when you have this sort of moment where you're like, well, am I gonna let my career actually kill me?
Yeah.
Um, is this worth dying over?
Yeah.
Um, and is that what I really want the focus of my life to be? I
Well,
think I had really internalized this idea because I am a childless woman, that like that my career achievement was a way that I um, sort of demonstrated societal value. And
yeah.
um,
Mm,
and so I've had to really do a lot of work to try to fight that feeling of like, if I'm not advancing in my career, um, if I'm not just achieving more and more, then then like, what does that mean about me as a person? What does that mean
yeah.
about other people's perception of me? And
Yeah.
so that's been my lesson. It feels really
Mm.
embarrassing and self-centered to talk about, but
No.
it's very hard, I think, to orient yourself away from achievement and ego. And
Absolutely is.
I'm not good at it, but I'm trying.
And I think the vast majority of people in American society can relate to that. Like the achievement paints the picture of your identity in ways that other things don't, especially when you get like, personal. And you shared about your, status as a childless woman, or, me, like for so long, a lot of my identity was, you know, I've got young kids and I can't achieve as much because I'm putting a lot of my time towards them. What does that mean for like the rest of my career? um, I think a lot of people can relate to what you just said. I was writing down a note, your relationship to achievement, the relationship to work. Those are just some of the takeaways you just shared. And I think those are all really critical subjects to discuss. Um,
Yeah,
and yeah,
I made this intentional pivot in my career from working in executive leadership, and I'm not anymore. And
wow,
there are aspects of that like there are aspects of that work that I miss, but I think the hardest part of the pivot has been sort of like, how do other people perceive this?
yeah,
And how much do I need to sort of justify this to other people
yes,
instead of, and what I have to keep trying to do is to like center it back in like, you know, I what are I have made decisions around my physical and emotional well-being. I work from home, which is really so much better for me physically, as a disabled person, and it's better for me mentally. And I also, when I took my job at VCU, I was really forthcoming about my disability status and about what my needs were in terms of disability accommodations in a way that I had not been at RISD or in any other place, because I was really trying to sort of reset that my the way that I have a tendency to like want to really, really dig in and overcommit. And, I was, while I was at RISD, I was also consulting. And so I wasn't actually making very much space for myself to do better or heal.
Yes, totally. So valuable. Thank you for sharing all of that. And as you were talking at one point, Misa, I was I had a reminder that I read this book. It's called I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening. And it's about, I mentioned it earlier, a Republican and a Democratic woman, they have a podcast. And it's about having like spiritual and grace-filled approaches to political discussion. But at one point, one of the women was like, on this question of identity, she said that she was afraid to ever raise her voice and to ever be seen as an achiever. And she joked somewhere in the book that her gravestone would read, "She made everyone comfortable, but no one knew her." Because it's that validation, it's that approval that you had talked about, that this other woman, and this is why I think what you were saying is so relatable. One of the authors of this book was like, I was driven by making everyone else, feel comfortable, feel happy, making sure that everyone's needs were met. And I never did that for myself. And I never let people know really who I was.
Oh, for sure. I remember, this feels like very weird to admit this. And I love the people that I work with at the University of Colorado are like very dear to me, and I love them. And some of them have been in your podcast. But I would have days where I would be driving into work and I would think, if only I could get into a car accident where it would be minor enough that I could be in the hospital but not die, and no one else would be harmed.
Yes.
And it was because I was so bad at being able to voice my needs, set boundaries, say like, I'm beyond my capacity, or I need help, or to like, feel I was just constantly in this state of like, I have to prove myself. I have to be strong. I have to making everybody's lives easier was a big thing for me in the way that I approached my leadership, like servant orientation.
Yes.
So yeah, I think there's a huge risk in sort of like losing yourself to that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in that risk reward paradox, though, the reward, I'm just thinking like on the spot, but like you have fundamentally shifted your sense of your physical and emotional needs in ways that you need and are being addressed. Like, as you mentioned, working from home, and you're very upfront in the interviewing process with VCU. So just speaking up for yourself and advocating for yourself.
But I still feel, I mean, I think the hardest part in all of this is still sort of like, how do I make meaning of my life? What does that mean now for the rest of my life? So, even in becoming better at at self-advocacy and at caring for myself, I've created space in my life, but what it feels like I've lost is sort of like this feeling of like impact and I don't know what the answer is there. And I think what I kind of keep trying to interrogate within myself is like, what if the answer to that is outside of my career and I don't look for that in my career? What if I sort of think about that in my relationship to my community or in the ways that I help other people? And it doesn't have anything to do with my career, even though my career is still important to me and I love VCU and I feel strongly about VCU, but I'm just trying to sort of reorient myself in a way of like thinking maybe success doesn't have to be defined that way for me.
Sure. Yeah, and I think it is a process. I remember after my blood clots, I was talking to a therapist, this awesome woman in Newton, Massachusetts, and I said, I'm really struggling with like feeling like I should be perpetually grateful that I'm still alive. And and she knew what I was getting at, and she chuckled and she's like, well, Tim, you're not the Dalai Lama. You have your own lived experience. I think is what we would call it now. This was in 2013. So yeah, and it became, and so it's a process. For me, it was a process to like adjust to like I can't possibly live in perpetual gratitude. So the same for you, like it may be a process to discern, where you will have that impact, and just to give yourself that grace, Misa.
So much, because the first year after my stroke, I just remember I would just tell everybody all the time, like, oh, my stroke was such a gift. It was such a gift. It taught me so much. It just helped clarify so much. It was such a gift. And then there's a point at which you're like, it's been 6 years since my stroke, and where I'm like, okay, there were good parts about that. It helped me get unstuck in many ways. So you do, there's stuff there, and
Yes.
it's not as it would be really lovely. It would be a lovely narrative for this story to have been, I had a stroke and it like, it changed the course of my life, and then I became this like, this happier, better person. And there's maybe little threads of that
Sure.
are true, but like, at the end of the day, it's like I'm still a human. I still have things that are hard and problematic and troubling. And so yeah, it's that feeling of like needing to feel grateful all the time. I totally get that.
Yes. Well, on that theme of gratitude, I've kept you well past the hour mark, but this has been such a deep and enjoyable, insightful conversation. I really appreciate you, Misa, going in the directions that you did with these questions about your identity and green chili, and then talking about fear. And this last question, your response to it has just been so enlightening. And if I can relate in some ways to what you went through, I know a lot of our audience will have similar connection to that theme. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you for a rich conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. For our audience, I will air Misa's conversation on YouTube, LinkedIn, Spotify, and Podbean during Hispanic Heritage Month, which again runs from September 15th through October 15th. So look for that on an upcoming Monday in that time frame. And thank you all for your support of People in Fundraising as well. Misa, have a good rest of your day, and I hope that our paths cross in real life sometime.
Thank you. That would be great.
Take care.
You too.